Hello students, today we will learn about the complex weaves that produce type of figures and interesting surfaces on the in fabrics. And actually when we take figures can be produced either by warp or weft. And so these extra set of warp yarns or weft yarns produce the figures on the surface of the fabric. So these complex structures are those woven fabrics where the texture or design is woven in and generally contain more than 2 sets of yarns. So the extra set of threads either in warp or weft are made to interlace with the ground fabric at intervals. A distinguishing feature of these fabrics with extra material is that the withdrawal of the extra threads from the ground cloth, it leaves the fabric untied, and so nothing happens to the fabric. You can just remove the figure by removal of the yarn over there. Therefore, the strength of the fabric is not actually altered, but whereas in ordinary fabrics in which the figure is formed by floating the ground weft and warp threads loosely, the strength of the cloth is reduced somewhat in production of the figure and the ground, and so they are not very strong, but only when the extra warp or extra weft yarns are used and the figures which are formed are going to be durable and also they are going to be more prominent on the fabric. So, the advantages of figuring with extra warp or weft may be the getting the bright colors in sharp contrast with the ground fabric, and also the particular designs may be produced anywhere which we like to have on the surface of the fabric. And then another one is that we can produce very pleasing combinations by changing the colors in the ground as well as in the figures. And then coming to the extra warp and extra weft, when they are used, we are having figures on the surface on the face of the fabric. And so wherever these figures are not there, and so the yarn that is being used for this should float on the back side of the material. So now how to dispose this material is a real concern and it is a critical issue in these fabrics. There are different methods. One is that the extra yarn is allowed to float loosely on the background of the fabric. It is suitable for figures which are spaced very closely and having a opaque fabric, so that it is not seen onto the right side of the fabric. And in transparent fabrics where it can be seen, the extra yarn is allowed to float loosely on the back and then it has to be cut away. By cutting and simply leaving it will not be sufficient. We have to either stitch the edges and or otherwise we have to embed in some way, so that there will be durability of these figures on the face of the fabrics. And if you do not do stitching or binding problem, then the upper yarns will come out from the figures and thus the fabric may become very unsightly. In compact fabrics, the extra threads are bound in on the underside of the cloth, either between corresponding floats in the ground texture or by means of special stitching threads. And then the fourth way of disposing the unwanted floats are, the extra threads are interwoven on the face of the cloth in the form of small auxiliary figures or floats that add interesting fulled textures to the material. In order to produce these kind of figures, we need some arrangements to be done to the looms. For producing warp figures, we need a dobby mechanism and definitely 2 warp beams, one is for the ground, one is for the extra figuring. And then for producing weft figured fabrics, we need a dobby mechanism and also a drop box for a ground and also figuring weft, because drop box will be able to take this kind of the weft yarns in different colors and that, and then it can carry over the loom while it is being woven. Then coming to the designs that are being produced with extra warp. So, in this the extra set of warp yarns are used either to produce continuous designs or intermittent figuring, such as some striped patterns. The figuring yarns may be the same structure, having the same structure or as the ground warp yarns, or it may be different in size and the color and all other structures. And in continuous figuring, we see that the extra set of warp yarns are arranged continuously in the order of one extra and one ground yarn. The extra ends are allowed to float on the back of the fabric during weaving, and later they are trimmed off in the finishing process, and then the figure is stitched at the edges. So, the stitches are arranged in such a way that they soften the outline of the figure, and thus the figure is not distracted from the bright outline and other things. An example here we can show, A is the motif design of the extra warp threads and B is the ground weave, which is a plain weave. The repeat size of the figure design is 8 by 10 and the ratio of the ground to figure thread is 1:1, and repeat size of the final design becomes double the design repeat, and so it becomes 16 by 20. If the ground weave is a twill weave, then other ratios are maybe possible, that is 1:2 or 2:2 or some other ratios can be employed. Then coming to getting the intermittent figures. In this, the extra series of warp yarns that are introduced intermittently and form various types of figured stripes. They may be detached figures or a continuous figures. You will be seen in the form of a stripes. When we see it from long, we will only see the stripes. Maybe they are not connected sometimes. So, as the spaces between the figures are less, generally the floats that appear on the back side of the fabric, they are connected and they do not require any trimming. They can be left like that. So that there may be a danger of they may be picked up in between, but generally it does not happen, and so they are left like that in the striped intermittent production of these warp figures. Then coming to another weave, which is a popular weave, which is based on warp figuring, is lappet weave. So, it is characterized by figures formed by introduction of extra warp yarns into the base fabric, that is generally plain fabric. In dotted Swiss fabric, the pattern of the figuring yarn can be seen more clearly on the back side of the fabric. And on more complex lappet weaves, the design motif appears as though it is hand embroidered, because it can be seen that it is a continuous design. Upper portion of that will have very good floats that form the design, and so it looks like a hand embroidered fabric. And so sometimes people think that it is a hand embroidered and not a lappet weave fabric. So if the weave is close together, then they are connected by a float on the back of the fabric, and if the designs are little far off, then definitely the float is being cut and then it is being stitched. Otherwise, it is left without sharing if they are very close together. So, patterns are generally woven by means of an attachment to the loom that consists of a frame, or a rack carrying long needles and fastened to the loom near the reed. And these the yarns used for making the figuring, they are actually threaded through the needles, and when the rack is lowered, the needles are pressed to the bottom of the shed and held in position while the picks are being laid over. And then the rack is raised and the pick is battened into the cloth and then already interwoven into the ground warp and weft. And then in the next step, the rack is shifted to a new location and the same thing can be repeated. Thus, we will get a kind of designs which just look like a embroidered design, because nowadays many machine embroidery machines are available, and if you get a pattern over there, how it looks in the same way here also in a lappet weave, but then these lappet weave fabrics are produced and with the figures that are woven at the time of weaving and not after the weaving. So, the design motifs in lappet weave fabrics are considered to be comparatively long lasting and durable, and because of the ground weave, which is a plain weave, and generally these fabrics are expensive, and so the fabric will also be having close weave, so that the durability of the fabric will be maintained. So, the design motifs usually remain in place longer if floats are left in the back than if they are cut off. And however, long floats are more subject to breakage during use, and so the complexity of the design is in this particular lappet weave is limited, and then these fabrics are definitely expensive than the other fabrics, because they have already produced some interesting surface on the fabric. Then coming to extra weft figuring, this figuring is done by use of more than 2 sets of extra weft picks in addition to the ground weft that is available. And only one set of warp yarns are used for this particular construction. The figures are being woven with extra set of weft yarns that float on the face of the fabric in desired position as per the desired shape and size of the figure. And the designers generally play with a number of designs over here, and many designs are possible over here, because weft we can generally and easily we can manage rather than the warp designs. Warp designs require a lot of complexity, but these designs are simple to produce. Just a shed needs to be performed at places where this particular thing is required. Then for this purpose, the looms employed for weaving should have supportive features for inserting more than one weft. As in case of warp wefting, if it is possible to have continuous figuring and also intermittent figuring using extra series of warp yarns. Here also one or more colors may be employed. Generally, in one continuous horizontal line, they may be using just one color, or in some complicated weft figuring, we can find that each one may be alternatively may be having different colors also. It is possible to have different kinds of things in this. So, in the example shown here, A is the repeat design of the motif, that is 10 by 8, and the weft lift is indicated by X mark, and the ratio of the ground to figuring picks is around 2:2. Even though plain weave is shown in this particular example, but other weaves like a twill weave or hop sack and other weaves may be used here. Then coming to a type of weave based on the weft figuring is a swivel weave. The swivel weave produces fabrics in which a figure is achieved by the introduction of extra weft into the base fabric to produce spot effects. Decorative dots like circles or squares formed by the figuring yarns are prominently raised above the base fabric, and there is a difference in this. That means that the topmost layer that gives the figure on the surface will be a dominant one when compared to the ground one. You can see them, they are not flat, they are little raised in this particular weave. The yarns to be used in each pattern are wound on small quills, and they are placed in a small shuttles, and these shuttles are used for taking the weft yarn through the small sheds that are formed in the loom. And these shuttles are strategically located at points where the designs are repeated. So, the pattern mechanism causes the shed to be made, and then the shuttle carries the yarn through the shed and through the pattern till the pattern length is present, or length or width, only through the pattern thing only it will be taken, and then it reverses from there. So, it is not carried from one point to other side, or one side of the fabric to other side across the width of the fabric. No, it is only taken from one warp yarn to the, say for example, in a repeat we have around 10 warp yarns, and then in that case it will be only moving between these 10 yarns. It will be going over and it will be moving these two. these 10 ions. Repeat maybe 1 repeat, 2 repeats, 3 repeats and all. So, along the repeats it will be taken around, and thus it will be only moving at this particular point, and it is not taken from one side of the loom to the other side in this kind of thing. So, the process is repeated to produce the desired patterns in this, and as the yarn is winding round the ground warp yarns, it is fastened securely and usually cannot be removed easily. And if we want to remove it by force, the ground fabric will be disintegrated and we do not find it in a proper shape. Then swivel fabrics may have different colored yarns also running in the same horizontal row, or the color will however be the same in each vertical row of the fabric. Swivel fabrics can also be identified by the effect that is being produced on both the face and the back of the fabric. They will be same, and maybe you can take the some of the fabrics that are being woven in Benares and all other places. We can find that this kind of weaving is seen. In India, it is commonly called as Jamdani technique, and it looks like the same. The particular effect of the design will be same on both the sides, because there are no floats over there in that machine, in that particular fabric, and it will go at the back also it will interlace, and in the face also it will interlace, and thus you find that sometimes reversible fabrics are also possible by using this swivel weave. And then coming to the fabrics in which the figures are being formed by use of both warp and also weft extra yarns. These are called spot or dot fabrics. The spot or the dot fabrics have a design motif that repeats across the entire width or down the entire length of the fabric. So, warp or filling figuring yarns interlace with the warp or filling yarns that form the ground fabric. The motifs appear where the figuring yarn lies on the fabric face. So, floats appear on the fabric back between the motifs. So, they are seen only on the back of it, and then a wide range of motifs are possible in this kind of weave construction, and the color of the motifs will be same across the row. If extra weft is used, then same color is seen in the figures forming vertical columns if extra warp is being used. So, some fabrics may be also reversible in this particular thing. So, the back floats may be either trimmed off or left uncut depending upon the spacing of the design motifs. So, accordingly they are called as clipped or unclipped spot fabrics. Standard dotted Swiss fabric as a popular material, it is made using true spot weave, is a clipped spot fabric, and sometimes the spotted designs are also produced using flocking. So, flocking is a method of a type of printing we can call it, and because here instead of a printing paste, actually a fiber array will be used, and these fibers are made to stick on the fabric in the form of a design. So, the fabric is first of all printed with a resin or so, and then over that the flock or the flock of fibers will be that is struck onto the material in a vertical position, generally in a electromagnetic field. And so, it also looks like a velvet fabric, but in use when you can find that these flocks can be easily removed. We can see whether it is there on the other side of the fabric. If it is there on the other side of the fabric also, then it is definitely by weaving. If it is there only on the surface of the fabric, then it is definitely by flocking. And so, people have to look at, the consumers have to look into the counterfeit textiles here. They should not be sold as velvet fabrics, which are more expensive than the flock printed materials. So, the durability of the motif depends upon the compactness of the ground yarns that hold the design, and also the smoothness or the roughness of the yarns used either for the design or for the ground of or both. So, the higher the compactness of the ground weave, the more the durability of the fabric. Generally, the uncut spot patterns are used for border designs having little space between the designs. In that case, Dobby attachment is being used for this one, and so that it can be left without cutting at the back. And then both clipped and unclipped spot weaved fabrics can leave the ground fabric without disintegrating, and even though it is not desirable. So, the fabric, nothing happens to the fabric, but by removing it, the the principle, the purpose of actually producing the figured weave will be lost. We have seen now the figures that are being woven with extra warp yarns and the figures that are being woven with the extra weft yarns. And when we want to compare these two, how they are going to be, and when we take this and we see that when we take the warp figuring, extra warp are being used in this, it requires no additional shuttle box and special take up mechanisms, but whereas in case of weft figuring, you find that they require a drop box with a modified take up mechanisms, and here in case of extra warp figuring, we need 2 warp beams, and whereas in the weft figuring we require just 1 warp beam, that is for the ground weave. And in case of warp figuring, you find that this facilitates high production because it is only 1 weft that is being inserted, and whereas in the case of weft figuring it is going to be slow, and also production of these things will require a lot of these shuttles, and these shuttles have to be moved from one edge to the other edge, and so it requires more time, and so the production of these are less. Advantage of producing the striped patterns and also the spotted designs are possible in case of extra warp figuring, but in case of this weft figuring, only the spotted designs can be produced. And in case of warp figuring, and we need the yarns which are really stronger, and because they have to be on the loom during the weaving, and whereas in case of weft figuring, the strength of the yarn is not very important here. In case of warp figuring, it generally requires more complicated drafts, and whereas in case of this weft figuring, that is going to be very simple. There is no problem at all. Simple drafts can be utilized for this. And then in case of warp figuring, it exhibits the figured effects less prominently, whereas in the warp figuring, then we find that they are very prominently made, and the production is also, that is why it is less. And in case of warp figuring, there is more scope for getting more colors, and whereas in weft figuring, you will be able to get few colors, there is no doubt, but they are only limited to the capacity of the shuttle boxes that are being utilized for this purpose. Definitely expensive to dispose the back yarns that are floating in case of warp, and so that is a complicated process in case of warp figuring and in case of weft figuring, and it is more economical and easier to dispose of these weft threads. And say in case of warp figuring, and it poses a constraint in repeat size when working with on an ordinary type of jacquard loom, but in case of weft figuring, no such problems exist in this. Thus, we have seen that depending upon the function actually and the type of figure that is required, we can employ either to have more of warp, extra warp or extra weft. And so, whenever expensive fabrics are required, and maybe they can go for warp figuring, and wherever economically they should be made, the fabric should be made, we can go for the weft figuring. And but weft figuring produces a prominent one, and sometimes we do not require that prominent figuring on the fabric. So, sometimes even fabrics are there with a self design, we call it as a self design, because the woven figure also is of the same color or maybe little lighter in shade than the ground fabric or little darker in shade than the ground fabric. In that case, we find that warp figuring may be a better one, because it is not a very prominent one and the production is very high, and whereas in case of weft figuring, whenever a fabric or a garment or a may say saree and other things with if a prominent figure is required, then they can go over the weft. And also this weft figuring will not leave much of the floats at the back, and so disposing it is also easy for these things. And thus we can produce lot of designs, and a designer is free enough to have any kind of designs as they like.